You must be Brian Keenan. I'm John McCarthy. How do you do? I want to see the sun.
This is your son.
If we're attacked, everybody goes boom.
You afraid?
I'm long since past that. I just don't want it to happen in the dark.
They must have released a couple.
Hope for everything, John. Expect nothing.
John is a good boy. He hasn't done anything wrong. I ask whoever is holding him, they do not harm our son.
Stop it! In the name of God, stop it! I want to kill him, John.
You stand up straight, you stick that chin out, and you pretend they're not there.
I'm not afraid of you or your toy.
I'm really sorry, mate. I'm losing you.
You must not let all of this take over you, John. You have to show them that you still have a free mind.
Our prisoner here also can't go nowhere, can't do nothing.
You gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do. What part of themselves do they see locked up in me? And how much of me is locked up in them?
And I hesitated, and I also wasn't sure about seeing the film yet again, because I thought, well, I've seen this film 4 times. But the extraordinary thing is, I watched this film as if I hadn't seen it before. It has that kind of magic to it. It's such an extraordinary and great film that I can see different things in it every time. I mean, you watched it for the first time, most of you. I'm deeply, deeply moved by it. It's an incredibly moving film. I mean, the story is moving, but also I think it was probably very moving for me knowing that Brian and John were here, watching the film with us. That adds a kind of extraordinary dimension to it. So I think we're very fortunate to have you both here. And Johnny, once again, I mean, I must congratulate you. I know you talk about the team that are around you, and some of them are here. Before I sort of open it up and for questions yourselves, I wanted to ask you both if you would mind talking a little bit about what it feels like seeing yourself on screen and what it feels like revisiting something that you lived and went through over 4.5 years and seeing it distilled into 90 or so minutes. So maybe starting with you, Brian.
Okay. This is only the second time that I've seen this movie. I seen it when it first came out, and I was very impressed. But my head, I think, was still locked in, the machinations of making something. Now, almost, 25, 30 years later, looking at it, I find it powerfully, like it gets inside to, I'm very bad at this, a place I thought I forgot. I think that's very much down to the 2 actors. I once said about my friend over here, Ian Hart, to an audience that I thought Ian Hart could play Hamlet or a hobgoblin. He's not bad at playing a hostage either. Linus was just superb. These 2 were so perfectly matched. The journey, as I understand it, between John and I was, when you're in this situation, the 2 personalities merge and pass through one another. And you take resources and strengths and abilities and stuff through the presence of another human being, because they validate you. And I think that film brought that very, very back to me. in a way I didn't think was possible after all this time. You know, I'd lived with the bane of hostage for so long now, I kind of forgot about it. So that's my touch on that. That was kind of like, you know, when a diver comes up from the deep and he has to come up stage at a time, and a stage at a time, and a stage at a time until he gets to the surface. That was a very kind of hard rush up to the surface for me. So that's my feelings.
Thank you very much. John, you saw it more recently.
I did, and it was like Brian had seen it obviously years ago and then hadn't watched it again. And I think life had carried on and one had moved on doing other things. And also, very importantly, we both had children now, and they're all with us tonight, which is lovely. But you know, we've met many times, had wonderful times. We've travelled together, Brian and I, and moved on from those dark, horrible cells. No, I do find it's gut wrenching. And just even looking at the fucking chains that we had on, it brings that back. The weight of those bloody chains, as a physical thing that obviously almost is an emotional thing. But it shows how you can cope and bear that weight together. And I was just very lucky to have him here with me.
But one question I had that interests me is how you and Brian and then John worked on the script. How did that? Did Johnny approach you? Had you written Evil Greatly by then? When Johnny
No.
No, you hadn't. No.
What happened was I had an idea when John was locked up that I wanted to do a kind of a drama documentary about the hostages who were still there. As a campaigning piece. So I went to meet a friend of Johnny's, I can't remember his name, Johnny, he lived in Devon.
Mike Crigsby.
Thought about it, and then thought, well, we'll see how we could do this. I wasn't too sure, because you're conscious all the time that these guys are still locked up back there. And the guys that told us were not fools, they all read the papers. They knew what was going on in the world. Well, their leaders did. And then when I met Johnny, I was living down the west of Ireland. I went to hide out down there to get away from the press. And we began talking about it. And I remember I was staying in this little cottage at the back of Crowpatrick, and the hills going up to Crowpatrick, Ireland's oldest and holiest mountain, and nobody could find me up there. And I was sitting with John, and we lit a candle, and he produced a bottle of whiskey. I don't drink spirits, but maybe there was a spirit there, not necessarily in the alcohol. It was something. Maybe it was a candle, maybe it was the darkness, maybe things just started to come out, the way they're supposed to come out, raw and direct and honest. I once talked to an artist friend of mine about writing this book, and I said I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and he said to me, just be fucking honest, Brian. And so, but that's the way a story has to be told. There's no propaganda in this story. It was about. It wasn't about them and us. It was about that there's a them in each and every one of us. I wonder what I'd have done if I'd grew up where they grew up, and somebody shoved a Kalashnikov in my hands, and I was 17 or 18 years old, with us frig all else to do. It doesn't take away from their brutality. People know when they're being brutal. They know when they're being savage. They know when they're being totally fucking unreasonable. They know that. But the terrible tragedy about that place out there is maybe the disease of hatred has been too long festering, and it's very, very hard for people now to kind of rationally self-examine themselves. Poison, that's been festering, a hatred that's been there since biblical times. And that's how long it's been there. It's not been the last 50 or 60 years. It goes right back. I read about it. When they give me the Bible and the Quran, I read about it. I read about God saying, smite them, wipe out my enemies, and it said all this all over the Old Testament or the Torah, and the same stuff came out in that kind of revolutionary or revelatory language in the Quran, about wiping out the enemy. And you find it in the Psalms, calling out to God to smite my oppressor and all of this. So there was I locked up with your man here and beginning to understand where all this came from, And it didn't just come from these lads who were there, something else.
But that's one other thing, Brian, just remembering that those lads who did, some of them, clearly we see them in the film portrayed, did some very brutal things. The majority didn't. And I think we reflected that, when we were taken in 1986, the Lebanese Civil War had been going for 10 years. So those guys who were 18, 19, 20 years old, the younger guys, the junior people, if you like, their formative years from the age of 10, they'd been living in the carnage, the chaos of civil war. And yet, for the most part, yes, the whole situation was brutal, chaining us up and pushing us around with guns. But for the most part, they didn't step over the line and indulge in brutality, like we see the character Abed, the real man, Abed and Saeed doing. They couldn't resist that temptation. And I think that was important, and that struck us. I think we recognised that. And indeed, Cap Brown, Ian, whoever they are, you show that in the film, that you can understand somebody when you're addressing them. And that was important.
Well, they were with us, for 5 years, the same guys, so you become human to them because you have to be. Like the guy said, we're all prisoners here, and he had an understanding of what was happening, but there was frig all he could do about it. And I think they had sympathy somewhere because they knew you, they fed you, they took you to the shower, they took you to the toilet every day for 5 years. They knew who you were. And I suppose the resolution to any conflict is knowing and being sensitive to whatever your enemy or your opposite number is. And these were kids, after 5 years, they knew who we were. They knew we were hurting. And I suppose somewhere, because they're human inside themselves, they felt maybe guilt, maybe shame, maybe hurt, their own pain, their own desperation. So we were, as the boy said, we were all prisoners here.
How long have you been in Lebanon?
5 months.
You are English.
I'm Irish.
Where do you come from?
From Belfast, you know it?
I know it. Belfast is British.
But I am Irish. I travelled here with an Irish passport. I'm entitled to one. Just go and ask the embassy. How long are you going to keep me here?
Can you remember what attracted you, Johnny, in the first place? Was it through Mike's Grigsby that you got to hear that Brian was interested in doing something?
Yeah, Mike took me over because I'd been selected supposedly as one of the 12 most promising new screenwriters in this country. And he was talking about doing a drama documentary, and I said, you don't know what something is until you actually deal with it. It could be a drama documentary, it could be a drama, it could be a movie. And very quickly, when Brown and me, became very apparent to me very quickly within a couple of weeks, that this was a biblical story and a kind of spiritual story. And it just naturally became a movie, really, just the way I responded to it and saw it. And I was incredibly lucky with both these guys because I could ask them anything I wanted and they would tell me. And so, the most brilliant resource for somebody like me and all I had to do is turn it into a screenplay, really.
You did pretty well.
The big problem at that time was that the backers wanted this big star cast. They had Ken Brown and Hugh Grant at one stage. Was the
Hugh Grant.
But these are the two guilty parties, of course, because the truth of the matter is that Brown and John inspired absolutely everybody. As far as I'm concerned, they were like viruses. They took over my whole life, really, for a very, very long time. And my job simply was to spread the virus as best I could.
Me, it's Ben Gunn. You must be Brian Keenan. I'm John McCarthy. How do you do? I'm a journalist. You know, I actually did a TV report about you. Probably the worst bloody mistake I ever made in my life. Do you smoke?
I do. Last one.
Not a problem. You know, your students, they went on strike after you were taken. We went back and filmed the empty classrooms.
Sure. Did you report me as British or Irish?
Well, you're out on the wires as Irish. I spoke with someone...
Hold on a minute. Who the fuck's Ben Gunn?
What? Well, you must know who Ben Gunn is.
Fucking idea. I've had a paper for weeks.
Ben Gunn, you know, the hairy castaway in Treasure Island. Remember? That's why you obviously hadn't seen yourself for a bit then.
Is there a roving mic here for the gentleman, second row? Thanks.
John, Brian, could I ask you about your feelings on present situation in Gaza, Israel?
On the scale of depravity, you know, slaughtering teenagers and babies, you know, and bombing a hospital and killing 500 people. I don't know on the scale of depravity what balances out with what. Instead of reacting to the politics of the latest atrocity, you know, people need to get further back. Other people, I think, maybe should say nothing. And it's hard not to, you know, say something on this. I once talked to Robert Fisk. I've been back to Lebanon quite a few times. I like the food. And we were talking about, you know, whether journalism can be impartial. And I was asking him the question, and he said, no, it can't, of course it can't. And I said, what do you mean? He said, because the journalist has to always be on the side of the victim. And I quite agree with that. but who's the victim here? There's a lot of victims, and that's where you begin to untie the thread of this hatred, accepting that that's what we have in common. We're all victims, you know. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you call yourself. You kind of have to work from that baseline and forget about the wrongs of Hamas and the rights of Israel or vice versa. Because that just, blood begets blood and you go back down that road again. So if I could say to Robert Fisk, you know, how would he answer that? And he would just say the same thing. You know, you have to support the victims. It's got nothing to do with anything else. He also, he talked to me, this is interesting. Now Robert's dead, so, but I'm not talking behind his back. I walked around his apartment when I went to visit him, and in Lebanon on the Corniche, and the walls are lined with books, hundreds and hundreds of books. And he went to open a bottle of wine or something, and I was looking around the books, and they were all by Robert Fisk, every one of them. all in different languages. So I said, so that's very, very interesting. And then we sat outside on the balcony, and he said, it wasn't that he got morose. He just went into a kind of quietness, which is unusual for Robert Fisk. Robert Fisk loves to talk. He really, really likes to talk. And on the subject of the books, he said, I wonder now, did I make any difference? I didn't know at the time Fisk was dying, and he knew he was dying, and he hadn't told many people. But that's what his thinking was. And did he make any difference? And maybe that's a question we all need to ask ourselves before we open our mouths. What difference can we make? Or how can we clear the ground? How can we walk Israel away from the cliff edge, from the abyss? You know, we need to ask those questions. How can we make a difference? Not add to, and look to what causes victim. What's being lost out there is, you know, the real victim is not the bloody bodies. I'm sorry for saying that. The real victim out there is human dignity, compassion, rationality, wisdom, spirituality, if you want to go down there. That's the victim out there. And those things need to be replaced, and they need to be dragged out of the desolation they've been kind of thrown into. I'm going to stop. I sound like I'm lecturing because I don't really want to, but that's my feelings about what's going on there.
Thank you.
All right, actually, take care. I just
John,
I typed that as we were watching the film, I've obviously been thinking about, as people have, about Israel-Palestine and the horrors of the Hamas thing and the ghastliness. I mean, God knows what's going to happen in Gaza, and I'm thinking, how do you express that? And I remember many, many years ago, after coming home, sitting down with my dad in his house in Essex, and he was a lifelong Tory, and he was talking about the evil, well not evil, he wouldn't use that word, but the horrors of the IRA campaign and bombings and such like. And I remember telling him the story that actually Brian tells in the film, or Ian as Brian tells in the film, about that man being forced to walk up and down in the snow in his bare feet in front of his children. And I said, this is something that Keenan told me when we were banged up there. And he listened. And he went, that's really interesting. I think about that differently now. I said, that point about, wouldn't this make you, would you as a boy being treated like that, or seeing your dad being treated like that, maybe turned to violence to think you've got to fight your corner? And he completely got that. Obviously Brian Lee Pat well. And I think that, when I heard that in the film again tonight, that really struck me as an important moment in the thought for myself in terms of the current upsurge in conflict. That unless you can begin to accept that people have suffered desperately and for generations, and you begin to give, and just to understand it and to look at it, whichever side it is, but you will listen to the other side's story and appreciate and accept, or be willing to accept, that there may be humanity there, then we're all fucked. And I think, you know.
Any other hands up?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask the question to John and Brian. Brian, you were released, of course, about a year earlier than John, and in the film, there's that, for me, that, I mean, there's so many, obviously, we all feel that very strongly, that there's so many amazing, moving and shocking moments. And then there's that scene where you're dancing, or Ian Hart's dancing in Ireland, I think, you know, remembering that times that you had when you were imprisoned. And then there's that, for me, that extraordinary time when you get the call and then you're waiting. And I just wondered what it was like that year, really, having had that closeness of friendship, and then to have to be apart. Yeah, what was that like?
Well, when I was first released, you don't know you're released until you're home. And then, you know, you're carried away in this tidal wave where everybody wants to embrace you. And I don't know, maybe that puts a veneer over what people call survivor guilt. I felt somebody had pulled my arm off, and I didn't know where it was. Or maybe I did know where it was, but I could never go and get it. So there was a lot of that, but it was all kind of hidden away somewhere. But I knew what was going on. But there's no point in me talking to people about that, which is one of the reasons I went down to the west of Ireland, because no matter what your problem is, you have to deal with it yourself. It doesn't matter who gives you help or who thinks they're helping, you still have to resolve it yourself. And it has to be yourself that does it. And you have to do it to yourself and with yourself. So I drove about the west of Ireland for about 9 months with the contract from the publishers to write a book. And I couldn't write it because I didn't know what was happening. These guys are still locked up. And I suppose it was a kind of waiting for Godot situation, you know, in the sense that your life was quite fraught in a quiet way, because only you knew what this was all about, and what coming home was like, and what you left behind there. And that was really very hard to deal with. I remember when I was writing the book, I went off. I used to get up in the morning, get in the car, and drive off to somewhere. And I took like a reporter's notebook, an old jotter thing. And I drove down to a long stretch of beach in Mayo, looking for images of desolation and aloneness and wilderness, and drove to a graveyard and writing down images of death and whatever, and somewhere else. And I went home, and I tore all the pages out and set them on the bed, and took a tape. I spoke that book into a tape recorder. I didn't write it. There was none of this, or I spoke it all into a book. And I switched on the tape, and it just started. I didn't look at the pages. You know, maybe I just primed myself enough to let it out. It was ready to come. And I didn't have to talk it to anybody, because if you were talking it to somebody, they had to take it and understand it and ask you questions back. No, there was nobody there. It was just me talking to myself. And it took 2 sides, you know, those small mini tapes, 2 of those, so 4 sides, to write the chapter called Into the Dark. And when I had finished speaking it, I went to bed, and I slept like a log, and I hadn't slept for a long time. And I got up the next morning, and I switched it on, and I heard myself talking back to myself from that place where I had been. And the tears were streaming down my face, because it was me talking back to me. And I let that all settle. Switched off the tape and went down to the pub. And the Seamus in the pub said to me, I walked in and I ordered a pint of Guinness, and Seamus said to me, have you been away somewhere? And I said, no. You sure? I said, of course I'm sure. I wasn't away anywhere. So he sets me up the pint and he says, it looks like you were. So he knew. And so I was away somewhere. I was away somewhere that nobody else could go to, only me. And it was very revealing that he said that. And I never ever talked to him about that. You know, but, so that's the way I handled it.
And John, what did it feel like for you being left behind?
An enormous relief, really. Sorry. Brian would expect me to be that dumb, but I was very fortunate because I dreaded being separated from Brian, and it's very evocative. Okay, this was in the early days when Linus comes in and hugs Ian, you know, in the early cells when we were fearful of being separated. But yeah, the film so clearly shows how we learn from each other, but I feel it's more important to say that I learned so much from Brian and gained so much strength from Brian and his example of how to live, and his intellect and his ability to talk and understand and explore things. So I was concerned how I would be without it, should I be without him. But fortunately, whilst Brian was suddenly taken away, in fact, I was only shortly on my own, so I was reunited with some American hostages we'd been held with before, which we all chose not to include in the film, because it just makes it too complicated. And I think the rightful focus for Brian and I was to be Brian and I, and how we lived an extraordinary period together. So I was lucky that I could, but I was actually lucky that I wasn't left on my own, obviously, but also very lucky that I think I had the essence of Keenan with me and us together as I moved on for that last year with the Americans and subsequently with Philip Britton and Terry Waite. So, and actually there's this extraordinary thing that Bride left me and we hadn't had a radio or any contact with the outside world for 2 years. I think, yeah, about 2 years. I mean, we'd been with another American friend, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And we'd been allowed to watch the television occasionally, and they'd come in, and they put this tiny little black and white TV set way over there where that lady is sitting, you know, and we'd be chained up, so we couldn't get to it. And one night they switched it on, this little thing, you know, the Oscars ceremony. I mean, Matt, you know, we thought, ooh, who's that? No idea. What's that one? I don't know. But we watched it, you know, as you would, because it was the diversion and entertainment. And suddenly this guy in a white tuxedo comes on, hey, introducing the next category or whatever it is. And he said, who'd have thought a year ago that Nelson Mandela would be freed and the Berlin Wall would come down? Fuck me! I mean, Mandela being freed is cool, obviously, but the Berlin Wall, and we just looked at each other and thought, you know, that's been there all our lives. What does this mean? I think the next day or so we asked this guy Mahmoud, who was one of the better guys, someone we really could deal with. We always felt safe with. We said, Mahmoud, what's this about the Berlin Wall? The world has changed, and he just went, oh yeah, I think something happened in Germany. Anyway, so Brian, just thinking of what Brian did, went out of captivity totally ignorant beyond the fact that Mandela was free and the world had clearly changed somehow dramatically with the Berlin Wall coming down, but what that meant he didn't know. Whereas I then had a year with Brian's spirit wrapped around me, but coping and dealing with and sharing and managing with our American colleagues, cellmates, and Terry Wade. But also actually during that year I learned an awful lot about the world because we had a radio. So I came home in a way better prepared for release than Brian did. So I heard about him walking down Whitehall on the 5th anniversary of my kidnap with John Morrell, who was leading the Friends of John McCarthy campaign, and with Chris Pearson, who's here, and the yellow ribbon stuff. So I was sort of up to speed. He came out into an extraordinary void, not only of leaving us behind, others of us behind. And I don't know how the fuck he coped with that, but he did.
Can I just do you remember that night in your club? You had a kind of stag night, and we were all very, very pissed. And you were at the end of the table, and you said this absolutely wonderful thing, which I had to put in the final script, but it isn't, unfortunately, in the final film, where you started talking about this dream you'd had. And the culmination of the story was, I knew as long as I had this mad Irish Aborigine on my back, I'd be safe anywhere in the world. Yes, anywhere in the world.
That seems to me a good moment to stop. Thank you so much, John and Brian.
Okay, thank
you. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Rosie and the Irish Cultural Centre for hosting us.
Take off towel. You go home now. Family. Dublin.
What about my friend? I want to speak with my friend. Now. I will not leave until I have seen my friend.
Brian? You. Take shower.
I want to speak with my friend.
The pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the leaves are falling. 'Tis you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. For I'll be here in sunshine.